of profound and abysmal darkness. There's something else which we can't conceive at all. Dionysius the Areopagite called it the luminous darkness. Nagarjuna called it shunyata, the void. Shankara called it Brahman, that which can only, of which nothing at all can be said. Neti neti, beyond all conception whatsoever. And you see, that is not atheism in the formal sense of the word. This is a profoundly religious attitude, because what it corresponds to practically is an attitude to life of total trust, of letting go. When we form images of God, they are all really exhibitions of our lack of faith. Something to hold on to, something to grasp. How firm a foundation, what lies underneath us, the rock of ages, or whatever, ein feste Burg. But when we don't grasp, we have the attitude of faith. If you let go of all the idols, you will of course discover that what this unknown is, which is the foundation of the universe, is precisely you. It's not the you think you are. No, it's not your opinion of yourself. It's not your idea or image of yourself. It's not the chronic sense of muscular strain, which we usually call I. You can't grasp it. Of course not. Why would you need to? Supposing you could, what would you do with it? And who would do what with it? You can never get at it. So there is that profound central mystery. And the attitude of faith is to stop chasing it. Stop grabbing it. Because if that happens, the most amazing things follow. But all these ideas of the spiritual, the godly, as this attitude of must, and we have been laid down the laws which we are bound to follow, all this jazz, is not the only way of being religious and of relating to the ineffable mystery that underlies ourselves and the world.
Talked about obedience to authority and how this has been tested over and over at universities. I've mentioned many times about the Stanley Milgram experiments on obedience, done in the 1960s, I think it was, at Yale University. Repeated many times since then, and many other subsequent experiments in the same field are still ongoing, of course, to categorize humanity as to our willingness to obey authority, even if it's a deviant kind of authority, or even if it is perceived as a good authority, but in fact is deviant if you look a bit deeper. So it's very interesting to see how people could be persuaded during experiments to really believing that when they applied electric shocks to someone, when they could hear screaming, that this was actually happening, but it was okay if a person in authority, an authority figure, told them to go ahead, they got permission. This, again, is what you get in the military, and that's why atrocities can happen so easily in anybody's military. if the order comes from a superior, you simply obey because you feel they're taking the guilt and not so much you. You're simply obeying orders. That's been said over and over throughout the 20th century in inquiries after terrible atrocities have happened. That's what the people always say, we're simply obeying authority. All races, creeds are all the same, by the way. There's no difference in this at all. It's a human trait, a human factor. What they don't tell you, of course, is that they also do the same studies and did the same studies on the psychopathic personalities to see how they would react. And they do fascinating studies on them too. Lots of studies have been done on psychopaths, by the way, by the basic experimentations to find out who they are in the first place. They have lots of questionnaires and so on, which categorize the psychopathic types in universities, and they have special tests for them because they want to eventually employ them. If they are cooperative to an extent, if they're being well funded or paid or whatever in certain positions of power over others, but never at the top, of course, for those already the super psychopaths above them. But this is simply a technique, as I say, the Milgram experiment. You take it from simply shunning people because you're told to shun them, because they said something which made you blush because you've been trained to blush when you hear a term or whatever, or a question asked. You see? The neuroscientists are doing this today with all your new opinions and so on, and reprogramming you and training you to have these reactions. You're set to default, as they call it, default positions. And of course, Sunstein, who thinks himself as a great proponent from all this and an experimenter, and he's really a low-level player in it all. In fact, he's not really a scientist as such, way up at the top. He helps push all this stuff and how to mass manipulate you by what he calls nudges. They also use this in the programming of computers to make sure that you're nudged towards a certain way of where you're asking us an initial question to nudge you to certain answers and ignore other things you could search for yourself because others have looked at this, so they nudge you towards what others look at, the approved nudges and the approved websites and so on. Very simple stuff. And you also find too that people take on roles so easily. They become their jobs, for instance. What do you think the movies are all about, with the constant war on terror, SWAT teams, and so many movies until it's normal again? And also going into martial law scenarios for the greater goods, with black-clad goons looking like the SWAT team. They all look the same in any country now. They're churning and churning and churning them out as they train you into this new authoritarian society, overtly authoritarian rule, but also using massive psychology upon you at the same time to make sure that your conscience kicks in if you start to think maybe it's what they're doing is wrong. You're not patriotic or something like that. Very simple. But because you become your job, and people in uniform you should be really scared of them all, actually. Uniform means uniformity. It's not individualism. When you join the military, you leave your individuality at home, or just toss it out the window when you put that uniform on, and you simply are now the team member. Your little worker bee, and the pheromones of the queen are the ones that are going to dictate what actions you do. You simply obey them, or you'll get stung. But you find too with the Stanford prison experiment of 71 by Zimbardo that people become their jobs. Tremendous experiment, that too, where eventually those who were picked to take the role of the prison guards became the brutes, in other words. And it was interesting to watch even the movies they put out about them that were done supposedly very realistically, to see how people really react. Now this can be done to a lot of you out there, and without you even thinking about it, or even if you poo-poo the idea it could happen to you, don't ever kid yourself that the psychologies and the sciences that are working against you by understanding how you tick. And today, remember, they know all your information. We're all studied. And people who think, well, I don't care about my information. I've nothing to hide. They're as silly as can be, because, they care very much about you. They want to be absolutely sure that you will do eventually anything they tell you to do and order you to do. That's why they study you so intensely.
Everyone's heard of the experiments on shocks that were given in a big experiment in not just one but different universities, where they'd bring in supposed people who would administer the shocks to others they'd see through a glass, other students that were strapped in a chair, and they would have a dial with different levels of shock to administer, and they administered on command of a supervisor. Those experiments were funded by your tax money to try and find out why people obey authority. As long as someone else is telling the one who administers the shocks to increase it and keep doing it, they generally will do as they're told. You displace the blame onto someone else. However, even during these experiments, they find the few who seem to enjoy administering the shocks. Now, the whole point with this was the one who was administering the shocks never were told that it was all fake. No real shocks were administered to the person in the chair, and the different people that would rotate in and out of those chairs were volunteers who knew they were not going to be shocked. It was all bogus, but they would scream and howl and make it very realistic. The whole point, as I say, is to find out why people obeyed authority, even when it became sadistic and cruel. A book was put out called Obedience to Authority by Stanley Milgram. That's Milgram. And that was Harper Torch Books. That goes through the whole experiment from every possible angle in an existential type of viewpoint. Remember, existentialists really have no real cry to emotions to deal with. They simply look at the observations, look at the data, look at the types of experiments, tear it apart, find out why it works the way it does. It's like taking a firearm apart to find out why it works, how it works. Nothing else really matters to them, because what they're after are the tools of authority and how to use that authority in obedience and get the obedience from your victims. And this stuff is passed up the ladder to all the big intelligence agencies, who really are behind it all too. Mind control did not begin with MK Ultra. That's a great misperception, that somehow it wasn't in vogue. Such a lie there. From the days of the first mental hospital in England, they were already studying human nature, and even before that. So this kind of information is vital to intelligence agencies who want to control vast amounts, maybe whole countries, nations of people, on behalf of the masters, the dominant minority, as it's called at the top. So people should go and read that book, Obedience to Authority, by Stanley Milgram, because it does give you an insight into what you think are the average person, people you'd even know, but we go into categories within this particular book. Male and female were sorted out, different age groups too, to find out if there's any differences, and they didn't find any difference even as to the ones who would apply the shocks on command. They just had a different way of dealing with it, or even displacing the blame. Quite fascinating, really, a study in itself, and I'm sure this, amongst many, many other experiments, this book has been widely read by those in authority at the top. What this kind of book portrays, as I say, is a society that can be manipulated to do anything whatsoever, believe anything whatsoever, by training just like an animal, because that's really how they view the public. And unfortunately, regardless of what we think of ourselves, is either a spiritual being or whatever you want to, however you want to look at it, is irrelevant to those at the top. They only look at what works for them. And they do see us as animals, and unfortunately, regardless of what we think of ourselves or how we think of ourselves, the techniques they use on us are very effective. Very, very effective. And that goes for people who belong to religions and those who don't. It doesn't matter. People of all categories come under the effects of these very precise sciences. I'll be back with more after the following messages. Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt, and this is Cutting Through the Matrix. Going through some of the thoughts that go through my head on a daily basis, and just before this program started, I went through and grabbed a book that came to mind called Obedience to Authority by Stanley Milgram. That's a Harper Torch Books publication. And in the preface, I'll read a little bit of the preface here, because it's interesting how scientists look at us. They cut out all really emotion, all the little things that make you human, that tie you to those around you, that dispel with the whole idea of love or acceptance and genuineness within a person, or even giving. They have to always boil it down to something in return because they can't understand being human. Scientists are very cold in this respect. They're psychopathic too, the ones who study us. And the preface says here, obedience, because of its very ubiquitousness, is easily overlooked as a subject of inquiry in social psychology. But without an appreciation of its role in shaping human action, a wide range of significant behavior cannot be understood. For an act carried out under command is, psychologically, of a profoundly different character than action that is spontaneous. The person who, with inner conviction, loathes stealing, killing, and assault may find himself performing these acts with relative ease when commanded by authority. Behavior that is unthinkable in an individual who is acting on his own may be executed without hesitation when carried out under orders. Behavior that is unthinkable in an individual who is acting on his own may be executed without hesitation when carried out under orders. Behavior that is unthinkable in an individual who is acting on his own may be executed without hesitation when carried out under orders. The dilemma inherent in obedience to authority is ancient, as old as the story of Abraham. What the present study does is to give the dilemma contemporary form by treating it as subject matter for experimental inquiry, and with the aim of understanding rather than judging it from a moral standpoint. See, there's no moral standpoint in observation here. There's no right and wrong in the existentialist type of point of view. It's just what are the effects. The important task from the standpoint of a psychological study of obedience is to be able to take conceptions of authority and translate them into personal experience. It's one thing to talk in abstract terms about the respective rights of the individual and of authority. It's quite another to examine a moral choice in a real situation. We all know about the philosophic problems of freedom and authority, but in every case where the problem is not merely academic, there is a real person who must obey or disobey authority, a concrete instance where the act of defiance occurs. All musing prior to this moment is merely speculation, and all acts of disobedience are characterized by such a moment of decisive action. The experiments are built around this notion. When we move to the laboratory, the problem narrows. If an experimenter tells a subject to act with increasing severity against another person, under what conditions will the subject comply, and under what conditions will he disobey? The laboratory problem is vivid, intense, and real. It is not something apart from life, but carries to an extreme and very logical conclusion certain trends inherent in the ordinary functioning of the social world. The question arises as to whether there is any connection between what we have studied in the laboratory and the forms of obedience we so deplored in the Nazi epoch. The differences in the two situations are, of course, enormous, yet the difference in scale, numbers, and political context may turn out to be relatively unimportant as long as certain essential features are retained. The essence of obedience consists in the fact that a person comes to view himself as the instrument for carrying out another person's wishes, and he therefore no longer regards himself as responsible for his actions. Once this critical shift of viewpoint has occurred in the person, all of the essential features of obedience follow. The adjustment of thought, the freedom to engage in cruel behavior, and the types of justification experienced by the person are essentially similar whether they occur in a psychological laboratory or the control room of an ICBM site. The question of generality, therefore, is not resolved by enumerating all the manifest differences between the psychological laboratory and other situations, but by carefully constructing a situation that captures the essence of obedience, that is,